I guess what have those space companies learned is like the idea of testing your product and testing your market earlier rather than aiming for perfection later. I still meet a lot of startups where they've got the product fully built and like, what customer specs were you designing to or who were you trying to? Like, oh no, I just decided this is the right design. I decided, and I've never spoken to a single customer. I guess there's a balance. Test just enough, build just enough, build something before you speak to customers, but don't build too far. Would be what I've learned.
Leading and scaling a business isn't hard because you lack ideas. It's hard because your time, your team's time, and your focus get eaten alive by the daily grind. Too many leaders are overwhelmed, under pressure, and bogged down by low-leverage tasks. I've learned this the hard way, scaling Nobody Studios, advising fast-growing startups and Fortune 500s, all while leading multiple ventures at once. I've seen firsthand how even the best executives get buried in meetings, lose strategic visibility, and burn out just trying to keep up. That's why I built the AI Executive Coaching Program, the same frameworks and tools that I've used in my own work to make it more meaningful, better leveraged, and more impactful. We're helping leaders in global businesses get hours back every week, turning chaos into clarity and operating with more leverage than ever before. This isn't theory. This is about identifying the traits you need to unlearn, the tasks pivotal to your success, and the tools that can be built into workflows to optimize your capabilities every day. From transforming meeting scripts into transcripts, into action plans, and spotting performance patterns you can't see on your own, we're upgrading the way executives lead. If you want to scale without losing your edge, let's talk. You'd be surprised how quickly you can lead at a whole new level.
Enjoying the podcast? Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on YouTube. This way, you won't miss any episode and it greatly supports our podcast. Today's guest is someone I first came across when reading Irish Insights, where we were both listed in Irish People in VC. And I'm really glad that we reached out, because it turns out that Maureen Haverty is one of the most fascinating people and has the best jobs you can imagine, helping people build the future of space. Now, Maureen is a principal at Seraphim Space, the world's leading investor in space tech. She's worked across startup, strategy, and venture. And what I love most about her story is how grounded she is while literally investing in what is going to take us off this world. This episode, we talk about what it takes to back moonshot ideas, what founders learn from the space industry, the similarities and difference between SaaS businesses and space, and how Maureen thinks about risk, resilience, and ambition when she's deciding to back the people who are going to the next frontier. It's a fascinating show that really got me thinking and my mind ticking about what it takes to create great companies in a space, in a place that we're going where we may be living in the future. So let's dive in and hear a little bit about her story and what inspired her to get into this industry in the first place.
I would prize myself on rigor. So I originally did a degree in civil engineering and I hated it because I felt it was kind of too imprecise, I guess. And why I love nuclear and why I moved into nuclear was it was like precision and, really rigorous physics and all that kind of stuff. And then when I went and joined a startup, I thought that like rigor was a really great thing to have. There'd be like lots of ideas like floating around the office and they'd be quite half formed. And we're like, oh, it's a terrible idea. Move on, let's get back to work. And eventually, my colleagues made me this t-shirt that said Dream Killer on it. Now, to be fair, they made another colleague a t-shirt that said Dream Killer. But basically, I guess the idea was like, there's such a thing as too much rigor and you're kind of killing a lot of ideas. You're killing all our hopes, Maureen. And I had to realize I thought it was actually a really good way to bring it up in some ways because it was both funny and it got the point across is like, look, there's such a thing as too much rigor. You're killing ideas too quickly or without letting people kind of run with them for a while. And I realized that it's not my job to kill half-baked ideas. It's kind of really kind of work with people and make them fully baked, and see like, okay, what can we change, and can I bring that rigor in a constructive way, and like, let's talk about it, and like really explain it to me. So I had to learn how to do that. And then maybe if people had like genuinely not terrible ideas, but it's just not going to work at the startup, as in like, we're not going to be able to sell that to customers. So someone wanted to use, is a space startup, someone wanted to build space hardware using TaskRabbits in our garage. And I was like, like, I just no. Like, I've met our customers, just no. But like, it's not my, like, what's the point of just saying no? Like, I was like, let me take this off your hands. Like, your job is to be really innovative and to have these crazy ideas, and it's my job to kind of go like, okay, right. So I took control of manufacturing, and like, I guess that was the first real big project where I was like, nope, I'm just taking control of this, running with it, and that kind of really started off my career in space. And what made the difference from me moving from kind of a nuclear engineer to eventually become COO.
So this is brilliant. One of the sort of debates that comes up a lot, especially in our studio, is the battle between killing ideas and giving them space and room to grow, and rigor. Because I think rigor it's a great word, and it's really, really important to create great things. But what I love that you're sort of describing in your own little journey there was the when you hear something that gives you that sort of instant reaction of like, okay, where is this thing coming from? We need to stop it. To this sort of insight, as you say, okay, where is this thing coming from? How can I shape it? And have rigor around helping people shape the idea. Like, that's a huge transition for people to go through, I find. So what were some of the little bits of rigor that you, instead of stopping the idea in its tracks to creating a system to really, test if the idea really has merit and can grow? What were some of those things that you started to bring in then to apply that rigor to the, if you will, the testing and the nurturing to allow you to either get to these conclusions?
Ooh, that's hard to point to specific ones. So I guess, first of all, it involved just like letting my colleagues like say their piece fully. And like, I was really fortunate at Apollo, which is a startup we were working at, that like everyone there was smart. Everyone there was smart in their own way. And I guess I would be probably on the more analytical side, whereas, and like my natural tendency, I'm not a design engineer. My natural tendency is not to go and build something to test it out. My natural tendency, where my talent side is like, even for my PhD, was like analyzing what happened to nuclear fuel, what happened, like understanding that, understanding the maths, understanding, like doing experiments to see what happened. Whereas I have some colleagues where like, they're just like, just let me build it. I'm just going to knock together something over a weekend and we'll see. And like, letting people do that and encouraging them to do that, or rather just stopping them doing it. And like, it's just like, actually, like, that's fine. And like, as long as it's safe, or like stepping in only when it's a distraction, or like a really serious distraction, that will be where I would come in. For something like the manufacturing, it was like, okay, like, let's put, like, I would say, okay, let me take control and like, let me put together a list of what all the possible options are. And I will, like, promise I'll put down the TaskRabbits idea there, and like, how does that help us with customers? How does that help us be fast? How does that help us be cheap? How does that help us have quality? And then you kind of like, you come up with, you test them out, you do a little bit of work or enough work on all of them to see if it has legs. So I guess it's trying to learn how to have just enough work on something is the balance. So like, not doing no work, not doing too much work, not getting distracted in your tiny team, but doing just enough work.
Yeah, this is great.
and basically also is like, the benefit in a startup or hopefully in any work is that there is a team, and there's ideally going to be someone who's like their natural abilities are doing the build, testing it out, and then there's someone who's going to like criticize it or assess it or apply the rigor, apply the questions, and like, okay, what if? And making sure that maybe you don't necessarily have the builder doing the analysis and the analyst doing the building, like take advantage of the team's talents in that way. I think maybe sometimes as well that, you'd have some people on the team who would have great ideas, but maybe great ideas with very high potential returns. And then they might not want to, again, because that's just not where their interest lies, is actually doing the work to get it to the end product. And I would be like, look, if we're going to do it, let's do it properly. There is a potentially really high return here. And managing the handover from the person who's had that idea to the person who's going to do more of the work on that idea, and kind of maintaining credit along the way, because obviously the reason that people don't want to hand things over is because they feel they lose the credit along the way. So it's like, being sure there is that kind of chain of custody and everyone knows like, well, it originates back from this idea and the idea was taken off them, not because their talents lie in idea generation and then she handed over to someone who can execute on it.
So these are all, it's funny, they resonate massively in a studio when we're trying to build all these different types of companies and ideas. Mm-hmm. Like characters you're describing where, you naturally have people who are great at generating ideas. They're just people that are great at that. And then there's people who actually can execute and get stuff done. And, they always have ideas too, but not to the same sort of boldness, visionary type characters. We see that a lot. But I like the idea that you're subtly started alluding to is like, how do you create constraints around these experiments to a certain extent? What's enough time, but not too much time? What's the right mix of a team to make it move? How do you transition an idea from, when it's on a whiteboard to a prototype to actually something that's scaled production? And there's craft in each one of those stages, but there's often different people that is involved in that. It's funny now as I start to know, that you end up becoming a sort of venture capitalist now at the end of this, because I can see how your sort of the physics of how you think about designing and managing uncertainty start to come into play here, about building systems to help identify and reduce uncertainty or manage risk, and also create space for innovation to happen, which again, it's sort of a really difficult skill. And obviously one that you've built up over time from being part of these businesses that were building either, essentially, nuclear items, and then building space and deep tech type technology, which again must be massively exploratory, some of these bets as you're sort of going through them. So talk to us a little bit about like, what is the ideation process like for space specifically? Because the numbers you deal with are like, there's production costs. They're big numbers just to play the game. It's not like a SaaS startup where I can spin up something on AWS in 20 minutes and run an experiment and it costs me $20. Like I feel like your minimum sort of stake to play is much more than $50. So talk to us a little bit about managing risk in that type of an experimental loop at those costs with the constraints that you've got to work around. Like, what are some of the methods you've had to learn?
I wish I could like provide some formula here, but I feel that the projects I worked on have been so different that they're like, it hasn't been as repeatable, where unfortunately I could say like, okay, well, we do X number of weeks, or we invest this amount of money, or that kind of thing. I think in space in particular, you have like several problems. I might talk about it really quickly from like how VCs see it. And the challenge is that I guess with a SaaS startup in general, you can probably bootstrap to some revenue, or
absolutely, yeah,
maybe one early small round, and then you can get to some revenue, and then you get it out into the market, and then really customer demand really starts to tell you a lot more about what direction you should go in. Is this the right product? I believe less uncertainty for VCs as to whether the market will actually be there or not, and actually also whether the product works or not. Whereas in something like space, traditionally you might have easily, you would be at your Series C before you would have a product that anyone can buy and generate any revenue. And that is obviously hugely risky for VCs, and that keeps a lot of generalist VCs out, which I think is really bad for startups because the generalist VCs have a lot of money. So I think there is a move now in the sector for startups. The best startups are starting to look at how they can reduce their MVPs and get something into the market and get kind of paying but discounted customers really on their first round. So what has changed even since I joined VC in space 3.5 years ago is, I would say it's gone from maybe I met 1 or 2 companies who are trying to get to revenue in their seed round to most companies are trying to get to some sort of product that goes to space and is generating a little bit of revenue in their seed round. And I think that's a really good thing. So I guess what have those space companies learned is like the idea of testing your product and testing your market earlier rather than aiming for perfection later. So that's something that I'm seeing that the best companies are doing. And I guess you were asking is like, how have I learned to like, okay, how much to test, how, like, I think internally in companies, it's trying to bring a bit of the as much of the software, build it quickly and see as possible. So companies that internalize their ability to build hardware, whether they buy CNC machines so they can do quick turnaround on parts, and all that kind of stuff, having a lot of technicians so they can build a lot of stuff and do that quickly. They're obviously better. That seems really obvious, but actually I guess particularly in Europe, 5 years ago, you would see a lot of companies that would be doing much more of like a Gantt chart approach to everything. We still meet, companies doing that, and like, oh, a test is a big one-off thing. We're working towards one test in 3 months. Whereas the best startups are like, we're doing 3 tests a week. Obviously, there's a really big one coming up, in 3 months' time. So you have to be testing every week, I think. So that's how they internalize. And then how do they burn down the market risk when maybe they don't have something to sell is they talk to their customers as much as possible. And the benefit of that in space is that you have, customers that are willing to speak to you. It is B2B and people are willing to speak, and, you're speaking to engineers who are like, this is really cool. So startups that are taking advantage of that. And all of that's really obvious when I say it out loud. But I still meet a very sizable proportion of startups that don't do that. I still meet a lot of startups where, they've got the product fully built and like, oh, what customer specs were you designing to, or who were you trying to? Like, oh no, I just decided this is the right design. I decided, and I've never spoken to a single customer. And like,
don't worry, that's rife in if you're a SaaS company or building space, that's still very much alive, sadly.
Yeah, and maybe I can see in something where like, okay, it took me 2 weeks, and obviously like, let's say with vibe coding, you're like, I'll just build it and someone can respond to it or not. I think there's huge value there, and I think one of the great things that we did it at Apollo, was like, we made thrusters, which are engines essentially for satellites, but actually just building an incredibly ugly, cobbled together their thruster that a customer could walk in and see, and they could see it being tested and respond to that rather than it being on a PowerPoint was exceptionally valuable.
Yeah,
so
right
again,
on.
what I'm saying is like, I guess there's a balance. Test just enough, build just enough, build something before you speak to customers, but don't build too far, would be what I've learned.
Yeah, no, they're great lessons, and like you say, like even as you're describing these principles, they resonate with me from the way I've thought and had to learn the hard way about building the wrong thing enough times to know, yes, we need to prototype, iterate, and test. But it's great to hear it in the context of these infrastructure, if you will, type builds where they're massively complicated. There's lots of probably more manual intervention as well than in software, where you've engineers, you've people actually creating components of a system to come together to become the final product, right? Software is, as you said, it's relatively cheap to prototype, and you can use one person with more machine because it's sort of virtual, if you will, to create it. Where when you're describing like building a thruster, there's so many different components that go into building this physical item that's going to go into the most harsh sort of conditions known to humanity and potentially work. And it's quite expensive to send it up there and find that out. So it's always interesting just to hear the principles hold, even though many of the actual practices and implementations are different, about how you do it.
Yeah, just like, you mentioned like sending something to space, and like, and it's the testing and sending it to space. I guess one really big mistake I made at Apollo, and it's probably coming from my nuclear background and the rigor, is for all space hardware, there are these standard set of requirements, testing procedures. If you test this and pass these tests, you're kind of guaranteed it's going to work in space, and NASA has them, and the European Space Agency has them, and Airbus has their own. And, we met these really experienced customers who knew exactly what they were buying. They're like, I don't need you to test in space before we buy it, as long as it meets, it's gone through these testing. I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. Engineers have sat down and thought about physics, and they've taken all their lessons learned and they put into those test requirements. And that basically no one would buy the thruster. Like, we don't need to go to space. Like, no one would buy the thruster. And my colleague was like, I just feel if we just test it in space like once, that is going to be the unlock based on the customers I'm speaking to. And he pushed for us to do a demo in space, and he got that organized, he found funding and all this kind of stuff. And like, we tested in space, and we did something like $70 million in contracts within 6 weeks. It was like literally everyone. I'm sure even like the really conservative customers, like, we were like, it's just test requirements. We're like, yeah. And the reason was, I learned the lesson then, but I learned why that was the case with all the customers then when I was at Astra, and I was like trying to buy solar panels and talk to all these vendors and new innovative technologies for the satellite constellation we were going to build. And I was like, there are all these, it's the exact same situation. There's all these test requirements, there's all this stuff, blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, I'm like, have you tested it in space? Because I don't know. I'm not an expert in solar panels. I'm not an expert in this. And at all these startups that we were speaking to, of course, they only had like 15 people on the team. They don't have an expert in every single bit of hardware on the satellite, so it's just like, does it turn on in space? It's like, good enough for me. So like now the lesson I've learned, and I tell everyone, is like, you have to get into space as soon as possible. It will just be such a big unlock. So yeah, it's just like, people just want the proof, and people want proof that they can see, and okay, they can't see in space, but they can, like, they believe you when they say it's turned on.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic to hear that, because one of the things we say in software a lot is, prototypes are great, but is it in production and people using it? And even to your point earlier about this sort of explosion of tools like vibe coding and all these, very exciting prototyping tools. And I call them prototyping tools for a reason, because once you start to get these products into production, and any sort of volume starts to hit them, they collapse, right? So whether it's a lovable or whatever, they're even programmed in a way that the more people that use the product, the more expensive it becomes. And I don't mean just it's a little bit more expensive, like it's a lot more expensive. Mm-hmm. It's designed to use up all your usage tokens as quickly as possible, so you have to pay more. So we've learned this the hard way in our studio, where we're prototyping products, and if anything hits more than 100 to sort of 200 users, the bills go crazy, and then the security falls to pieces, right? But again, great to prototype, horrible to productionize for scale. And it's interesting, again, as you're describing these like unlocks, about how close to the true operating environment can you get something? Because if you can get your product into a space where it's operating, whether it's literally in space for you, or for early stage startups that we think about comfortably serving 1,000 customers securely, safely, and not collapsing, and running at an efficiency that you can actually, scale it if you went correctly. It's a totally different game. And it does create this evidence that, you've had an idea, you've put energy into execution, that it's crafted correctly. And then at that point, you have confidence to say, if we put more resources, be that capital, people, etc., behind it, that this thing can really take off. Versus, it was a great prototype, but now we've thrown a few people at it and it's falling over and it's a disaster. And you often lose actually a lot of those early customers because of just a terrible experience. So what does that look like in your industry about, if you will, like attracting and retaining customers, that when you find these products that get through the prototype to this first production, to this sort of as close to real life operation as possible, when you started selling tons of these thrusters, like what does that start to look like in the context of space and deep tech? When you think about more of these businesses and startups now that you're looking at and ultimately funding, is like what gives you the confidence that this is something that can truly scale, rather than it was a one-off and there's still a huge amount of work to go?
I think that basically every successful space company that I can think of, or certainly very space hardware company, has had massive teething problems as they go from that 1 or 2 units, very much their MVP, to production and to working with a number of different customers. And one of the problems they have, they sign up 6 customers who've all got different requirements, and it's not custom, and everyone's like, it's not custom. It's like, oh, it's not custom, but we all have our different testing requirements, or someone wants to come and sit in the office, blah, blah, blah. The MVP is pretty far away from production, satellites or thrusters or whatever. And it can involve fairly significant redesigns. You might have to change suppliers, and everyone, I can give you like 10 companies I can think of, and another 10 companies that I'm confident are about to go through that pain. I would say the ones that have survived that and gone on to grow well they have really good customers and good customer relationships. They've got customers who are maybe sophisticated and understand challenges and want you to get through it. So sometimes they can actually be these really large commercial customers.
Yeah.
For example, kind of Airbus actually is notoriously good for working with its supply chain and really making sure that they survive. And I mean, you saw that with the aircraft during the pandemic versus what happened with Boeing, that Airbus is very good for working with you long term. The US government, so the military, buys a lot of satellites, a lot of hardware, and they're very good for sticking with companies and making sure they grow. Weirdly, companies that have stayed as startups and got the private capital to grow rather than those who've been acquired, they get acquired by these really big, what are called primes. So like a Boeing, a Raytheon, a Lockheed, and they kill them with kindness and they really slow them down. Weirdly, maintaining the fast, iterative startup culture, which doesn't seem to align with production and quality and all that kind of scale, actually does seem to give you, retaining the nimbleness. And also you've got a much more direct link to your customers, so you can really explain the problems to them rather than some acquirer who comes in and tries to bring in their own business development team and then ruins those relationships.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So now I'm really interested to understand, give me a sense of maybe quantitatively, how many people are in this space? Right, so because when you think about these primes, when you describe them like that, right, even the language is kind of interesting. It makes me think, right, there's some set amount of number of these companies, right, and they have a huge influence on the sector, and working with them is an imperative. And yet, to your other point, it can also make or break a lot of these startups when they're trying to, there's only so many customers that can go around, right? It's not, again, to the analogy that most people understand of a B2C type company where there's 8.5 billion potential customers out there, versus an industry where you have 20, 40, 50, and
Yeah.
why building relationships with the customers is so important to go on these journeys with you, especially if you're trying to create innovative products in an emergent space. So tell us, just help me understand, and the listeners understand, like what are just some of the numbers that we're talking about here, and how is the industry also growing as well as more people start to come into it?
Yeah. I wish I could tell you, I wish I could put a good number on like the number of people. There are basically about 5 major primes in the US. And what a prime basically means is someone who holds a direct contract with the government. And I guess that tells you kind of one major thing about the space sector is traditionally the major customer has always been the government. And
right.
Time they filter down, their subcontracts to their supply chain. And there are 5. There used to be a lot more, but basically after the Cold War, when defense spending went down, there was a lot of consolidation. And some of the dynamics that we're seeing now in space is obviously SpaceX got started, and they were competing with the primes on returning astronauts from the International Space Station, and they used those initial contracts to build their first vehicle and have actually leveraged a lot of contracts from the government rather than direct investment from the government to then go out to the private markets and get more funding. So SpaceX totally changed the game for everyone, but there's also the US government really doesn't want the monopoly or
absolutely right. It's in their interest to have a market.
They know that like if there's only 5 primes and actually only 2 of those primes or maybe one of those primes does any particular piece of work, can even bid in that piece of work, they don't like that. So they actually do award contracts through their SBIRs, through match funding, through indefinite quantity, indefinite delivery contracts, IDIQ. They help create a competitive ecosystem, and they're helping to get all of these startups going. And I think VCs have realized that the US, wants this competitive ecosystem. And you had maybe 3 or 4 years ago, you had a lot of satellite manufacturers that were acquired in the sector. So again, you lost some of that competition, and then the government gave new contracts to new startups getting going, and now you've got a much more competitive ecosystem again. And I think now that there's such a large opportunity and such large VC opportunity that these satellite manufacturers can grow independently without being acquired. So 10 years ago, companies like Blue Canyon Technologies, Millennium Systems, they were formed. They were basically bootstrapped to typically $300 to $400 million before they were acquired. Millennium was acquired by Boeing, and Blue Canyon was acquired by Raytheon. And bootstrapping to 400 million is pretty amazing.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, that's a pretty big number for a little software startup like me. I'm retiring on that. What do you?
Exactly. And, completely founder operated until the end. So they were acquired. But let's say if you look now at Apex, which is a new startup formed, I think, in like 2022. They have had VC funding, and they raised 2 rounds of VC funding. They're $200 million each this year, and valuing them at $1 billion. And they're nowhere near being acquired, I think. So like that's the change in the ecosystem in like the last 5 to 10 years, that there's enough private capital that people can actually grow, that they can get started and they can grow, and they won't need to be acquired early. So you were asking about like how many people, what's the like the,
well, this is what's exciting again for me, is just a novel or newbie space nerd to just understand how this space is evolving, right? As you're describing again, just the way that the ecosystem's being created, that the government is actually creating or at least trying to create an open, free market, a competitive market, it sounds like for once they're doing something to actually support a domain, and because it's in their incentives are aligned probably to do it, right? And it's working, which is, again, it's great to hear that type of thing in any sort of new emergent space. So tell us then really, Like, what are you starting to get excited about? It sounds like this idea of iteration experimentation is really propagating the industry. Yes, more people are thinking about testing in real environments. Again, fantastic to see these principles continue to hold, and that there is a real ecosystem starting to happen, and that it is encouraged by some of the biggest players, even at a governmental level. What does now space look like in the next sort of, as you say, that was the last sort of 5 to 10 years. What does the next 10 years look like? Like, when are we going to be out building more resources in space than we are building down here on the planet? And is that really, a picture that we can start to see come to life? Or are we still going to launch just millions and millions of satellites? The world will have to find ways out off the planet through the satellite.
I think they're saying maybe it's like 100,000 satellites or like 100,000 satellites, which is a nice number to get started with. So I guess it depends. It depends. Maybe this is the excessive rigor rather than vision coming into play. I think for a long time we're not going to see anything in space that you don't have to do in space. As in, if you can do it on Earth, you should do it on Earth, and that's because it is cheaper, it is easier. You can iterate faster on Earth, and we still have not, like, I would say that space kind of has an original sin, which is that stuff does still always took so long to build, design for space that it was completely obsolete by the time it was launched. That, like, the compute being launched was obsolete, and we have radically improved that because there's such frequent launch now that you can like build a satellite, and the satellite is now like, oh my god, the satellite is just like literally was finished today, and it is just being trucked it is being trucked like overnight, like by the company to be launched in Florida. So like that is how quickly we're moving. Like, satellites are not hanging around waiting to be launched anymore, and that is great. But I mean, it's still going to be hard. But once it's in space for like, I think realistically 2 to 5 years for most, maybe up to 10 if you're getting for a bigger satellite. So there's a level of obsolescence there. When Starship comes online, I'm a Starship believer, and I think it will be online reasonably soon. And when we're using it a lot, that will open up a lot of much bigger things in space. So you can assemble things in space, you can have robotics in space, you can have really large structures in space. And I think that, for me, is like the big game changer. I've thought like there's maybe 3 things that Starship will change. It will be much cheaper. It will go to different places. Like, it will go to the moon, and is hoping to go to Mars. And it will allow you to do much bigger things. Like, right now, we're not too constrained by how heavy things are, but we are constrained by how large things are. And for me, I think the big game changer will be how large things are. You can have much larger solar in space. You can have much more capable satellites, better payloads on those satellites. You can build large structures in space, which right now the only really large structure in space is the International Space Station. So now I think there are like 5 or 6 companies that are aiming to build space stations in space, as just one example. We're a long way away from like resource utilization, which is a nice way to say asteroid mining. I think we're a long way away from that. But yeah, so I think we're reaching a stage where kind of anything's possible, and there's enough new people entering the space market and ecosystem that we have a lot more options and a lot more new ideas coming in.
Yeah, well, listen, it's been absolutely awesome to learn so much about what's happening in that world, but also to hear like how much of the principles that have worked in many startup development, where it's rapid iteration, testing, and these ideas about making that as fast and cheap and inexpensive as possible, regardless of whether you're building these $100 million rockets or $5 prototypes on Lovable. Like, it's great to hear like these philosophies are coming in, and more different people are starting to join this industry. So yeah, look, thank you for sharing your story and helped us understand a little bit about what this space is about. It's been awesome to have you on the show. I think we need to get you back in a couple of years' time when we're starting to mine things on the moon, and you can tell us what the next horizon looks like.
I think maybe you were just like, too much rigor, Maureen. You weren't ambitious enough. We're mining asteroids all the time. But yeah, I think like the thing that's really exciting in space at the moment is like I personally believe that anything worth doing should have been done yesterday, and I think space is full of people like that, and I think that's what's separating the best teams from just the very good, and that's what's going to really change it in space.
Well, we'll look forward to that happening. Thank you very much for sharing and being on the show.
Cheers, thanks.
Thanks so much for listening. If you found this episode useful, make sure you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please consider leaving a rating or a review, as it helps others find our podcast. For more episode and details about the show, visit barryoreilly.com, and we'll see you on the next episode.